Welcome to the Quiet Casefiles, a place for calm, thoughtful mysteries told slowly and without urgency. This episode is a work of fiction, a gentle whodunit meant to be listened to, savored, and considered. I invite you to listen closely and see if you can solve the case before it settles into its quiet resolution. If you enjoy the story, please consider liking, subscribing, and following the channel. And a small favor, keep the comments free of spoilers so others can unravel the mystery in their own time. I have an old habit of noticing patterns the way some people notice the way a kettle begins to sing, the time it takes, the pitch, the hesitation before the whistle. It has nothing to do with the title. It is simply a manner of listening the world has taught me to practice. That night, aboard the last train north, the small attentions were what kept the darkness from feeling like a thing with teeth. The train was running late when I boarded at Callaway. It was the last northbound service, a long ribbon of carriages that would, by morning, knit together houses and lighted windows along the coastline. Outside, the air carried the flat chill of late autumn. Inside, the carriage smelled of warm upholstery and tea. A few people slept with scarves pulled up to their noses. Others read by the pool of their own lamplight. The carriage I chose was one of those quiet ones where people sit because they prefer silence to conversation. Perhaps that explained why the conductor, Ruth Hargreaves, looked relieved to see me when she did her walk-through. Ruth is a woman who keeps things in order with a voice that never need raise to be heard. She had the slow practice calm of someone used to reconciling timetables and temper. She carried a slim leather logbook and wore a watch not for style, but for keeping promises. She had a reason for being on the train beyond duty. Her son, she told me, had a hearing at first light in the town to the north, and she was traveling to be there. That was the sort of plain, honest purpose that fits perfectly with official hours and the occasional late train. In the next carriage sat Marjorie Tate, who made her knitting sound like a metronome. Marjorie was going to see a granddaughter she had not held since her husband died in the spring. She had the air of someone who kept letters in order and kept the past from floating away by cataloguing it in small, formal sentences. A private concern was gentler than most. She feared the small lapses of memory that come with some autumns of life. She told me, with a soft laugh, that she always carries a list in her coat. The list is a kind of map she follows from one appointment to another. Dr. Elias Munro was returning from a weekend seminar in the city. He is not a man who broadcasts his presence. He folds himself into a chair and reads, as many doctors do, to remind themselves of what other people know. He practiced medicine for 20 years in a town 2 stops north. His reason for being on the train was simply work, and his private worry was one of those things you do not announce, whether he had been enough for a patient who had asked more of him than medicine could give. Lena Ortiz had the habits of an alert person. She kept her hands busy, sketching on the corner of a ticket, fingering a thin pendant at her throat, humming without intent. She was on her way for an audition at a small conservatory up north. The money for the ticket had been saved out of shifts at a cafe. Her private concern was the neat kind that holds itself hidden under coat pockets. She had family matters to settle, a name to say out loud to someone who might have known it already. Conrad Hale sat furthest from the window, his briefcase resting on his knees like a companion. He had the precise look of someone who arrived at the platform with a mental checklist: briefcase, ticket, phone. He was traveling to visit his daughter, he told me, and to attend a small meeting that the morning would require. He seemed on the surface the kind of man who keeps the world balanced by keeping his accounts tidy. Privately, he had the kind of worry that eats at the edges of even the most disciplined routine. A matter of reputation and payments, of promises made in the quiet and kept in envelopes. Then there was the man who sat 2 rows ahead, a presence that left a small wake of discomfort. Augustine Reed, Gus, to those who offered him closer acquaintance though fewer did, wore his years like a habit. He moved as if the world owed him room, and he made no secret of the fact that he believed in the power of a ledger and the persuasive pleasure of a raised voice. He carried papers folded in a way that suggested their importance. He was, by his own admission, a man who collected what was due. People tend to have reasons for being at a place like that, some as simple as the need to get home, others softer or sharper. Our carriage rolled on. Conversation came in small, polite pieces. A joke here, a complaint about the lateness there. The kettle in the dining car hissed like a small, unhappy bird, and a man in a wool cap debated the merits of porridge. I listened, of course. It is what I do. I let my attention light on the small things, the way Ruth checked the door with the heel of her hand, the way Marjorie rewound a dropped stitch with the precision of someone practiced at picking back the thread of a sentence. I noticed too what people carried with them in the shapes of their movements, the way Conrad glanced at his watch, though the watch never showed the same time twice, the way Lena's fingers hesitated over the pendant as if it were a tiny talisman. Between stations, the train moved into the stretch of track that follows the river, dark, deep, and bordered by trees that were mostly silhouettes. It was there, in that pocket of slow motion, that the lights in the carriage dimmed a little, and the train's gentle forward hum dropped to a strange, stalled silence. Ruth's voice came, steady and professional, over the intercom. "We're experiencing a temporary delay between stations," she said. "There is no cause for alarm. We should be moving again shortly. Please remain seated." The minutes lengthened. The carriage settled into a different kind of stillness, not the kind that comes with sleep, but the kind that comes when motion has been interrupted and time has the space to collect its small secret things. People reached for their coats, checked their phones, folded and refolded the same sentence until the meaning changed. The reasons for each of us being there: Ruth striving for punctual duty, Marjorie keeping a list, Dr. Elias carrying a patient in his mind, Lena travelling on a ticket paid in careful coins, Conrad balancing bills in his head, and Gus carrying ledgers and small sharp threads, suddenly felt as if they belonged together on purpose. We had come together by accident, as strangers on a last train do, and that was enough to make the night feel like a small, contained place where anything might be quietly observed. I settled back, allowed the carriage to breathe, and waited. My attention, as always, made the room of small sounds and unspoken concerns into something like a map. The train did not move for a long time. Outside, the dark held its breath. Inside, people did the small things they do when the world stalls. They checked their pockets, folded their lists, and made more tea. It was the sort of night that, were you telling a story later, you would call ordinary. It is always in ordinary nights that the most significant things sometimes tip from one person to another, unnoticed, and lay quietly in the margin. I did not yet know which small thing would matter most. I only knew that I was awake enough to notice it when it happened. We moved, then we did not. The announcement that whatever had stopped us would be attended to came and went. A technician somewhere walked the length of the train, and the exhalation of a diesel engine suggested there would be progress, but the progress was measured in minutes that multiplied like coins in a palm. People began to migrate toward the end of the train, where a lounge car waited with lamps and a small cart that served tea and mugs of something flat and kindly. When the car came to a halt in earnest, with lights from a distant signal painting the ceiling in pale streaks, the conductor encouraged us to move there as a single household might gather around a long dining table. It is curious how strangers become neighbors in circumstances like those. There is a civility to enforced proximity, a mutual understanding that this is, for now, a shared space. Ruth, who had brushed her scarf into a neat knot, became the quiet anchor. She counted passengers from a mental list, noted injuries that might matter later, and made the small joke about the kettle behaving like an old family member who refused to be hurried. Her hands moved with purpose, checking the logbook, drawing the curtains a little tighter, keeping the reassuring rhythm of duty. We introduced ourselves in the way people do when they must be companionable for a while. Names offered, short histories, the reason for travel. I learned more than I had when I first stepped on board. Marjorie told me about the granddaughter she was visiting and produced, rather proudly, a photograph the size of a playing card. Dr. Elias spoke softly about his practice and the patient he had left in capable hands. Lena mentioned the audition and tucked the sketchbook closer to keep the drawings out of the public eye. Conrad spoke evenly of his daughter and the small meeting at morning. He handled his briefcase as a man handles a promise. Gus, true to form, offered opinions about timetables and the economy, and made no secret of his irritation at delay. At a table near the window, an electric kettle clanked and the young attendant with a tray asked what we might like. Tea was the default. Tea encourages the sort of exchange that is neither confession nor polite fiction. It is the middle ground where people can announce pieces of themselves and then retract them with the same hand. We talked, or allowed talk to happen around us. There was warmth. There was the peculiar hush of traveling strangers who were both watchful and melted by the common need for comfort. It was then that I began to catalogue not just faces, but habits. I have always paid attention to routine. It is astonishing how much a routine will tell you about a person, the way a hand returns to a pocket, the cadence of laughter, the little rituals that make someone steady. Ruth checked each heater in the carriage, making a particular note of a faint hiccup in the lighting that she promised to report at the earliest safe point. Marjorie kept her knitting bag on her lap, counting rows in the same soft voice she used when reading aloud. Dr. Elias had a habit of pausing at the end of a sentence in a book, as if to measure the weight of each phrase against his own thoughts. Lena hummed a single phrase of a tune, unaware perhaps that it was steadying her as much as her fingers, and Conrad opened his briefcase with the deliberation of someone accustomed to papers and signatures. People confess what they must. Conrad admitted that he had been making payments of a kind he described as necessary to protect a family's reputation. He did not say more. Lena, pressed for something like a confidence, revealed that her mother had been made homeless years before by an agent who made a living arranging rooms and closing doors. The word she used for him might have been a name. It was then, in a sentence that might have passed like any other, that my attention paused. Gus tilted his chin and, half-jesting, said, "I do like to know my dues are paid in full." He smiled as if it were a small domestic pleasure, but the way some people smile is like lighting a match, a small spark that shows more than the face intends. The cart made its rounds again. Cups were refilled. The light was warm and forgiving. People told stories not as proofs, but as ways of being known for an hour. There was an exchange between Lena and Gus, I remember. For its smallness, she asked if he had ever been to the theatre, and he answered with a story about an older woman who once refused to pay a counsel fee and then won a small victory in court by knitting every day until someone forgot why they had come after her. It was not a conversation after all, but two people trying on the shape of civility. A knock at the carriage door was soft. A man who had had his face set into a thoughtful frown. I later learned his name was Simon Blake, though I had not spoken to him, had been asleep in a corner and woke to ask the conductor about the service. He was an unremarkable fellow with a thin moustache and the sort of nervous smile people keep when they do not want to intrude. His question was practical, how long until the lines were clear. Ruth answered with measured calm and moved on to consult the logbook again. A wind of small tensions passed through the car as night takes on a more intimate scale. Someone mentioned an earlier dispute at a station. Someone else shrugged and said that travel always has its dramas. In these moments, small secrets press outward like tides. No one looked like a figure in a novel of crime, nor an obvious villain. They looked like tired people. That is always the peculiar sting of close quarters. The ordinary life of each person sits beside another's, and only by listening, by collecting the small, mostly unimportant things, can one begin to imagine how any of them might be moved to an act that would disturb the quiet. Before the night became something else entirely, I noticed two things that would later prove to be quietly important. The first was an envelope on Conrad's lap, the kind of soft, business-like envelope that suggested urgency and care. He tucked his hand over it when he laughed, and the movement carried a small tremor. The second was a small glass vial that slid, briefly, from Lena's sketchbook when she adjusted it. She covered it, threading a thin hand over it, and told a small invented story about herbal remedies for concert nerves. Neither of these things suggested anything nefarious. Both suggested lives lived with discrete private structures and pressures. We settled into a series of small adjustments, a caravan of people doing what people do when they are stranded together, trading fruit, checking watches, sharing stories of minor inconveniences. We grew smaller in our gestures, aware that the night outside was long and the place we occupied finite. As the car settled, I let my attention spread out across the faces and habits again. It is often in the way a person refuses to be hurried, or in the way they return to a pocket they have checked twice, that the truth, or at least the useful piece of it, will show itself. None of us had any idea then of the nature of the quiet that would descend. We only had the evening and the thrum of the train holding still in the dark. The last train north had become a small island where a handful of ordinary lives would, until dawn, be shared, watched, and remembered. I remember the moment of discovery precisely because it was, outwardly, so small. The lounge had softened into a lull. Someone had dozed with a newspaper over their knees. The kettle in the corner had been coaxed quiet. Conversation had dwindled to murmurs that were more like the throat of a river and the sound of people speaking. I had been paying attention to the way the lights caught at the edge of a photograph in Marjorie's hand when Ruth, who had stepped away to attend to the vestibule, called in a voice that was careful and slightly sharp. "Could someone come here, please?" she said. Her tone was the one used by professionals when a procedure was needed that was outside the ordinary scope of tasks. Without knowing why, several of us rose. The atmosphere in the carriage tightened in that specific way which creates the first chapter of every disturbance. People stop being casual and start being careful. We flowed toward the vestibule, the way water will take a channel. Gus Reed lay slumped at the far end of the corridor beside a closed compartment. He was not in the dining car, not in the lounge. The hall smelled faintly of his cologne and the sharp sweetness of spilled tea. He had his coat half open, and a paper sat in his hand like a small, abandoned thought. Ruth crouched beside him, hand steady as if she had done this thing more often than she would ever say. She placed a hand on his chest in the polite and measured way of someone checking for the things the body lets you know without words. "No pulse," she said quietly. I saw the way the people who had gathered drew backward by a step, as if there were a polite circumference to an event they were not prepared to enter. No one screamed. There was a hush that felt thicker than silence because it was made of deliberate breath, the breath of those who will not let panic spread. Ruth called for calm and, in the same sentence, asked that no one touch anything that might matter. She took the paper from Gus's hand as if protecting evidence and folded it into a sleeve. We framed the discovery the way a few human beings can when trapped without immediate access to aid. Someone runs the practical, while someone else manages the moral. Marjorie, who had once been a schoolteacher, began giving small, steadying instructions to the younger passengers, reminding them gently to sit and to breathe. Dr. Elias checked the basic points without undue flourish. His movements were professional and quiet. It would have been easy to describe what happened in loud terms, but the truth is that the discovery was a quiet, contained thing. A man lying still in a corridor, the sound of coats settling back into shoulders, a shared intake of breath. The first impression, the one that would be given to beyond us, was of a natural episode, a sudden death perhaps born of a heart that had given up under pressure. Gus had been a man of strong habit. Many people who knew him suggested it was in keeping with a life of sharp judgments and abrupt collapses. The word heart was used, perhaps, and maybe, appeared like small tentative hands reaching for explanation. But my attention, which likes to tether itself to the precise, noticed things that did not sit with a clean explanation. There was a cup in a bin near the seat opposite the corridor. The lid had been pressed back as if moved by a hand in a hurry. On the floor was a smudge that might have been tea or something darker. I could not tell, and did not try to decide. Gus's jacket pocket contained a folded strip of paper with a list of names and numbers, small handwriting that suggested a ledger. His watch sat on the table nearest him, the face turned up like an accusation. The hands showed a time that would later be important in the way a single biscuit crumb becomes evidence on a carpet. Small things like these do not, on their own, tell you whether a death is violence or the sudden end of a weary muscle. They are, at first, merely oddities that ask for context. We had no reliable signal to call for external help. The countryside in that long stretch between stations is stubborn in its silence. Ruth radioed our situation to the driver and to the nearest signal box. Messages were exchanged with a care that suggested caution, but no immediate resolution. The station at the next stop would not be reached for a while. We were, in the simplest sense, alone together. When Dr. Elias looked up from his check, his face had the strict calm of a man who had assessed something and found it urgent. "We should not move him if there is any suspicion of foul play," he said. The word carried with it a small, heavy weight. We had no police present. The carriage became a waiting room for a law that had not yet arrived. There is an odd, domestic awkwardness to waiting for something like an authority that is imagined but absent. People asked each other factual questions. Who had seen Gus last? Who had been nearest the corridor moments before? I listened the way I always do, noting the slips, the inadvertent hesitations. Conrad's fingers trembled when he brushed his briefcase. He said he had gone to the buffet to fetch another cup of tea. Lena, whose hands had been restless all evening, said she had been sketching in the lounge and stepping into the corridor only to glance at the stars. Ruth kept two lists in her head, what had happened and what must not be allowed to happen next. It is worth saying plainly that the discovery itself was not dramatic. There was no struggle to witness, no raised voice, no immediate accusation. The body was, in the manner of such things, a quiet interruption. It became our common problem, how to keep what little order we had while the rest of the world, the stations and the distance between them, decided how to come to us. That evening, as the storm of feeling that accompanies a sudden death gathered slow and low in the carriage, I made the choice I always do in such circumstances. I listened and I watched. There are moments when the world presents itself in small, unassuming ways that will later stand as the pillars of explanation. I set those moments down in my mind. People began to move through rehearsed roles. Ruth, with the practiced calm of a conductor, took notes in her little logbook. Dr. Elias maintained a gravity that made the scene sensible. Marjorie offered tea and comfort in equal measures. Conrad retreated into himself, checking his phone though. The signal mapped only emptiness. Lena folded her hands over the sketchbook, as if closing the scene of a drawing before it is finished. I stood at the edge of the group, and let my thoughts gather. The facts were simple to list. Gus Reed was not moving. He had been found in a corridor. No one had witnessed the action that had led him there. All events that involve human intention begin with a small moment, a word, a movement, a glance. We had a collection of those small moments now, recorded in the memory of a few people whose own recollections would be, in time, the materials of a resolution. None of the witnesses were categorically guilty, but none were entirely without connection. That is the peculiar geometry of a carriage-sized tragedy. Proximity makes possibility. I kept my attention measured and my curiosity steady. I had no wish to intrude. Still, I noticed, and when one notices, one must be ready to act with care. The first practical thing Ruth did was to tape a simple sign on the corridor door. Please do not disturb. It was absurdly domestic in its gentleness and perfectly right. She reorganized the passengers into halves, those who had seen anything, who could be near any relevant evidence, and those who had not. She sat with a notebook and a pencil the size of a baton, keeping a steady hand. It is astonishing what a pencil and a ruled column do to a frightened room. They give it structure. We answered questions in pairs and threes. Dr. Elias took the more obvious medical queries and worked with the mannerly patience of a man who knew not to leap to conclusion. He was thorough in what he said and precise in what he omitted. Marjorie told Ruth the exact order of the tea service table, minute by minute, as if she were reciting the movements of a small, familiar ritual. Conrad sat quiet for a long time, his briefcase a close thing held against him. Lena begged off from too many questions by making small, nervous jokes about her inability to sit still. The transport of ordinary life into an extraordinary setting has the odd effect of sharpening some memories while blurring others. I kept my own list. I do not make a practice of interrogating people aggressively. My questions have the softer aim of making space for truth. I ask in a way that invites, not corners. So I asked in the manner of conversational stone-tossing about the evening and the minutes before discovery. Who last saw Mr. Reed moving on his feet? I asked. Conrad raised a hand. His voice was low and tight. I spoke to him a little while before. He was pacing near the vestibule, making notes. He asked me to attend to some payments. He said something about a schedule. Payments for what? Marjorie asked. Her knitting paused like a metronome at a rest. Conrad's face tightened, but he did not answer the question directly. He said he was due money, he said. We had a conversation, that is all. There are ways of shrouding and ways of revealing. Conrad's sentence was frayed at the edges. His private concern, the matter of payments he had hinted at earlier in the lounge, clung to the sentence like lint. Lena offered something different. I saw him at the buffet, she said. He was talking to the attendant about a list of names. He dropped one of his papers and was annoyed, snarling, really. He was unpleasant. Did he mention any names? Marjorie asked. Lena hesitated, a small bitter taste passing over her face. He used the name of a woman who used to rent from him, she said. It was not a pleasant tone. Dr. Elias leaned forward. Unpleasant how? Threatening? He asked. Mocking, Lena said, with a sort of delight in being the one who holds the harder card. It is often in the way people describe the small cruelty of another that motive gathers. Not every unpleasant man should die for being unpleasant, of course. But if your life has been tangled with another's habit of cruelty, you may at least understand why someone might not be moved to anger, but to an act meant to end something that has been eating at them. I turned my attention to the small items that sit at the edges of scenes. There was a cup with the lid pushed back, a note whose end had been frayed by haste, a watch that showed a time when it was not expected to. I asked questions about ordinary things. "Who poured the last cup of tea Mr. Reed had?" I asked. It was not as unimportant a question as it sounded. Rituals of serving and receiving often provide the simplest threads between people in a confined space. "He had his tea with him most of the evening," Ruth said. "He liked it black. He had a cup earlier in the lounge." "And where was the cup found?" I asked. "In a bin near the vestibule, lid off," Ruth said. "Someone must have picked it up and taken it to the bin." There are two sorts of answers in these moments. Some are direct and tidy. Others, like Conrad's were wrapped in a kind of self-preserving language. It was not the answers themselves that made me take notice, but the way they were offered, the micro-gestures that do not belong to a script. Conrad's fingers were always fidgeting with the fold of an envelope. Lena's voice came with a hesitancy that matched her hands. Dr. Elias answered slowly, as if testing his own memory against the softer data of emotion. I asked Conrad about the envelope. "Is there anything in the envelope you do not wish to discuss?" I asked, meaning only to create space for truth. He looked at me and something unmoored passed through his face. Confusion, fear, then the smoothness of a man used to keeping a place tidy. "Personal business," he said. "I prefer to keep it private. Privacy is a kind of shelter. In ordinary circumstances, it is natural and proper. In the sort of liminal space we were in, it develops a shading, privacy as right, privacy as shield. One must not insist too long on an answer without cause." Ruth wisely moved the conversation elsewhere. The passengers volunteered small details. Simon Blake remembered hearing some raised voices while he dozed. "Like two men arguing, but I wasn't sure," he said. His recollection was hazy, which is of course to be expected. Still, we set the time roughly. Voices before the kettle clatter, murmurs that match the time on someone else's watch. Marjorie, whose memory was most fussed about, remembered the exact sequence of the tea service. She was the sort of person who would remember the way a spoon scraped a mug. That evening, she recalled a clipping of a paper Gus had commented upon, a mention of evictions and rented rooms, and the way he had laughed at the inconvenience of others. This is the sort of small cruelty that lingers in people's ears. Dr. Elias observed the body with a clinician's reserve and said nothing dramatic. He would not, could not, assert cause without examination. He could, however, note that there were no immediate signs of a struggle in the corridor where Gus had been found. That alone moved the circle of suspicion inwards toward questions of who had been alone with the man and what private conversations had evolved into something less innocuous. "We must keep things as they are until we get proper authorities," Ruth said. She had the natural authority of someone in charge. People nodded, and the conversation slowed into a knitting of small assurances. But beneath it all, the subtle shifts began. Eyes lingering on Conrad's hands, a glance towards Lena's sketchbook, where something lay folded, the way Dr. Elias tightened his mouth when a suggestion of foul play was mentioned. Questions are a scaffold, and on that scaffold we stood. We did not yet accuse, but we made space for an honest exchange. I had no more proof than anyone else. What I had, in the peculiar way I was built, were observations and a patience to hold them until they hung together into a pattern. The passengers had reasons for being where they were. They had private matters. Sometimes a private matter, left long enough, becomes a motive. I took the facts as they were, with no hurry to pin a label on the night. I sat with a cup of tea someone had offered me, watched the small circles the steam made, and continued to listen. When the usual routes of answer, the neat explanations of time and place, fail to satisfy, one must widen the net. It is not sufficient to know what people say they remember. You look instead for patterns, the habits that are consistent with a certain kind of movement, the tiny repetitions that link a hand to a pocket to a paper to the person who would be likely to guard it. I returned to the corridor's edges where the light pooled and the dust motes made small, slow accelerations. Details are patient things. They sit and wait to be noticed. The watch on the nearest table was my first point of interest, because it is the kind of domestic object that tells time, but also tells of the hand that set it down. The hands on the watch pointed to a time that I wrote down, 11:47. That detail, like a small pebble in a stream, later made ripples. Ruth had made a note of the times at which she checked the compartments and at which the driver had promised a report. I listened to her calm account. She had last seen Gus upright and moving along the corridor around 11:30, reading one of his folded lists. Simon Blake had dozed and been roused by the kettle, hearing a hushed exchange that might have been an argument. Marjorie's memory placed the tea service a few minutes earlier. There were threads here that converged on the same narrow band of time. I had begun, at this stage, to watch people's routines under more focused light. Conrad's envelope had been mentioned by him. He kept his hand over it and adjusted it like a man keeping a recalcitrant animal close. When he rose to fetch his coat, he did so with the quiet panic of someone who has suddenly been asked to tidy something that will not quite fit. His shoes were tidy, his trousers creased, the leather of his briefcase was worn in the place where one keeps the hand. All of these small notes said he was used to doing precise things in precise ways. Lena's restlessness became its own kind of data. She smoothed the pages of her sketchbook in a way that suggested she was trying to hide what was beneath, or perhaps simply to comfort herself with a familiar motion. When I asked to see the sketchbook, she hesitated a moment and then handed it to me. The pages were filled with short glimpses, a face in profile, a hand holding a cup, a window. On the back page was a small folded piece of paper. I unfolded it and found a neat line, "For the things that make me steady." Inside, wrapped like a tiny secret, was a small bottle, corked and labelled in a handwriting that might have been her mother's, for nerves. It was herbal in suggestion. Nothing in it gave me cause for alarm. Lena's face registered relief at seeing me turn it over and do nothing more dramatic than read. Dr. Elias was forthright when I asked to see his satchel. He unzipped it with a motion that had the clinical cleanliness of someone who keeps instruments orderly. There were bandages and a small supply of medication. There was, as he explained, a little vial of insulin for a neighbor he helped sometimes. He seemed almost apologetic at having the instruments of care in such close proximity to an incident, and his eyes were steady when I asked if he had used anything from it that night. He had not. These small practical checks are not meant to point fingers so much as to assemble the map of possibility. If someone carries something that could harm, then it becomes a potential. If someone carries something to soothe, it is also a potential. I keep the list of potentials without investing them with guilt. The human heart will often prompt an action that seems unacceptable in a moment of fear. It is our work to hold those moments up and look at their edges. It was Marjorie who supplied the most unexpected piece of the puzzle. She had been knitting in the corner and had, as she often did, been listening to the precise sounds of the carriage. "I remember a flutter," she said, sipping her tea. "A coin dropped, I think. Or paper." He cursed, and then someone else said something. I could not hear the words, but the tone, it was more than annoyance. "Which way did they go?" I asked. "Toward the vestibule," she said. "They were near the buffet, then toward the corridor." I thought, naturally, they were simply late for their stop and would be moving along. I did not think much of it. The ledger that I had extracted from Gus's pocket, the folded list of names and the series of shorthand notes, was a small, human document. It had the sort of detail that someone like Gus would keep, amounts, crossings out, a neatness that suggested both regularity and irritation. There was one line in particular that had been annotated with an initial CH final. It was the kind of mark an accountant would make if something were overdue. I had tucked the slip into my own pocket, not to keep but to look at later, and the initial took on a weight as I held it. There are small things that people do that are not accidental. Conrad's habit that night of clasping his envelope, of checking his watch, though the watch did not need checking, the way his mouth pursed when the ledger's initial was read aloud in the lounge. These were not confessions, but they were weak spots in the armor of composure. People with neat lives will sometimes do untidy things when the neatness is threatened. I observed as well the absence of expected marks. There were no signs of a struggle in the corridor, no displaced suitcases, no knocked-over lamp. That does not in itself exclude violence. It merely suggests an encounter of a different geometry, perhaps a confrontation of words, and one quick movement, perhaps an action taken in a space too narrow to accommodate drama. The time frame, roughly between 11:30 and 11:50, left a narrow window of presence and minimal motion. We sat with these observations in a silence that was not without kindness. People kept their own counsel. Ruth made tea as if nothing had changed. She offered it with the same domestic authority she used for everything. In small things, people find something like solace. Conrad accepted a cup but did not drink. Lena smoothed the pages of the sketchbook and avoided direct sight of the ledger I had placed, with Ruth's permission, on a table. The pattern I began to see is not the single line of truth, but the weaving of several slender chords, a ledger marked CH, an envelope kept too close, a small glass vial like a talisman for nerves, a man who spoke with the kind of cruelty that makes other people sleep shallow. None of these things alone dictates guilt. Taken together, however, they make a kind of geometry that points at a likely possibility. People make ordinary errors. They feed into debts they cannot bear. They keep letters they should not have. They press on in the quiet with a false steadiness. As the night held us, the train a small island on the black river of the countryside, the patterns were what I had to work with. I folded them in my mind like paper cranes, looking for the one fold that would make them a single shape. The more I watched, the more I felt that the solution would be gentle in its revelation and human in its root, not the work of a monster, but of people who had been pushed to the edge by small cruelties and private pressures. That is often how such things begin, and later one can see the inevitability in it only by allowing the fine threads to speak for themselves. The carriage that night was quieter than a library. People moved like they had agreed on a new tempo, subdued, cautious, and with an avoidance of sharp movement. There is a certain choreography to grief and to the shock of discovery. It contains its own etiquette. I walked through that etiquette, as if it is a room you must not rearrange, taking one careful step at a time. Conrad's restlessness had settled into a deeper fatigue. When we sat together at the little table near the lamp, he looked as if he had aged 10 years in the space of an hour. He kept his hands folded over the envelope in a way that was almost reverent. I do not press people unnecessarily, but there are times when information must be invited gently. You said he asked you to attend to some payments. I began conversationally. Did he name you? It was not a trick. It was an opening. Conrad's eyes steadied. He said he had a list, he said. He showed me a page. I thought it was his usual business. He used my daughter's name once, as if it were a fact. He laughed. It was a cruel humor. Did he ask for money in the moment? I asked. He suggested it. Conrad's jaw tightened. He said he liked to collect. He said some obligations were unavoidable. His voice dropped as if the words themselves might accomplish harm. I let him speak. People will sometimes unburden in small disjointed pieces when they feel understood enough to risk honesty. Conrad gave me a sketch of a life lived by making small concessions for the sake of family. He spoke of letters and small envelopes. He did not claim to have killed the man whose ledger lay folded in the room like a small cold thing. But he did not lie either. Lena, who had disappeared into a corner to sketch in the dark by the dimness of a lamp, offered up something in the form of a recollection. "I saw him earlier," she said, voice small and tight. "He was with Mr. Reed for a moment near the kettle. They spoke. I could hear Mr. Reed's voice, the way he says things that make a person thin with shame. I thought perhaps it was business." "Did Mr. Reed know you?" I asked. She looked at me and the face changed, becoming the memory of some tiny wound. A long time ago, his agency handled a set of rooms my mother had. He refused to extend her tenancy when the payments were a week late. My mother, she lost a lot. I still have the letter. She drew something from her pocket, a small folded paper with a neat, merciless line from years ago. She kept her fingers on it with a tenderness I recognized. Her private motive was not the grand sort of violence you read about in sensational stories. It was pained and nearly human, and that is what made it so sharp. At one point, Dr. Elias asked, "If one of you had seen anything suspicious, anything at all, it will help us mend the timeline." He spoke quietly, but his calm had a weight that encouraged honesty. People offered fragments. "I saw a man leave the corridor in a hurry," Simon said. "He had his hat on. He moved as if he were trying not to be noticed." Marjorie, with her attention to the small turns of speech, remembered the conversation near the buffet and the way Gus had tapped a page of his ledger with one finger as if counting someone out of the world. There was a conversation later that I had with Ruth. We spoke of process and of the small duties of a conductor in such a time. "We must protect what we can until the authorities arrive," she said. "We must not allow rumor to become action." She spoke as if she was stitching a seam in an old coat. There was honor in that, and a certain fatigue. She had worked the line for decades. She had seen sadness and the long aftermath of poor choices. She did not look surprised to be making lists tonight. She looked tired and a little older. I had occasion to look again at the ledger. With Ruth's permission, I unfolded the note I had kept from Gus's pocket. The handwriting was small, the list of names neat. The initials glanced across the page like constellations. One in particular caught my eye because of the mark beside it, an abbreviated CH, the same mark I had seen earlier in a different place. Underneath it, a short scrawl, "Final." It is a phrase used by people who make the ledger the instrument of their power. Final means, in ledger terms, the moment of closure. That same night, in the half-dark, I took the liberty of looking more carefully at the corridor itself. Under the skirting board by the compartment door there was a faint smudge, as if from a shoe. It was not dramatic, not in the way of the clumsy smear one associates with a hasty departure. It was small and dark, and when I crouched it seemed to match the tread of a gentleman's shoe. Conrad's shoes were orderly. They bore the faint line of a marker where rubber pressed against leather. It was nothing anyone else would notice. But such traces are a kind of handwriting. There is an odd temptation in these stories to play up the theatrical. I have seen detectives in plays dramatize confrontation until guilt itself must confess. I do not work like that. I watch small things and wait for people to give themselves away in the gentle failing gestures of those under pressure. That pressure shows in many ways. Conrad's fingers trembled when I asked about the envelope. He avoided direct eye contact when Gus's ledger was taken from the table. He gave answers that were economical and true in the minimal sense. He did not claim to have touched the ledger at any point. He did not describe any violent encounter. He was, outwardly, a man who kept his trouble to himself. Other concerns emerged. Dr. Elias told me, in the privacy of a brief conversation, that he had a small sense of guilt about a patient he had not been able to help. He gave the detail quietly without deflection. It was not related to the night save by the theme of private remorse. Marjorie revealed that facial recognition sometimes leaves her with a sharper memory for names than for dates. Lena agreed to show me again the small bottle that had been rolled into her sketchbook and explained that her mother's remedies were for calming and not for harm. She spoke of a small fealty to the past that sometimes lodges itself in the body as anxiety. So the shapes began to sharpen. We had the ledger with an entry marked CH. Final, the envelope that Conrad held with the uncanny tenderness of someone protecting a secret, a witness who saw a man leave the corridor in a hurry, a small smudge of tread that matched a tidy shoe. The normal human world, a world of accounts and auditions, of payments and retired school teachers, had converged in a narrow way, on a single corridor on a train stuck between stations. The shadows shifted, not with thunder and accusation, but with the quiet rearrangement of responsibility. I kept my voice low, my questions spare, and my attention open. In the day that followed, more would be said and more pieces would come forward. For now we were left to sit and watch the small movements of each other and to let the night fold around us like a shared, uncertain blanket. It is in those folds that truth most often prefers to hide. There is a particular pleasure in the discovery of a small, overlooked object. It has nothing to do with triumph. It is closer to the sensation of finding a single glove in a pocket you had not expected to check. In the quiet hours, when people drifted for short naps, and the corridor smelled faintly of cold tea and warmed upholstery, I found such an item. I was walking partly to keep from sleeping and partly to keep my attention limber when I paused by the buffet. Someone had left behind the small wooden sugar caddy that passengers pass among themselves in a ritual of polite hunger. Beneath it, tucked in the crook where a finger might lift the lid, was a scrap of paper. It was not the sort of paper one expects to find with a suddenness. It had the edge of a receipt, a small stamped corner indicating a transaction, and a handwritten note in a small purposeful script. The note read, "CH, tonight final settled." Beneath the words, in a different ink, was a numeral and a small mark, a quick scrawl that might have been the completion of a business done. The paper was creased in a way that suggested it had been folded into a neat rectangle and kept in a pocket for a moment. It was the sort of detail that can be explained away as an administrative piece. It is also precisely the sort of detail that connects a man to a moment. I showed the scrap to Ruth, who sat with the log and the poise of someone who is constantly engaged in making small sense of disorder. She did not flinch. "We will include this in the report," she said with her calm steadiness. "But quietly, Mr. Crowe, it does not make a man guilty. It does, however, show that there was a negotiation. Some people do not like to be faced with the closing of a book." "Who might have had access to that caddy?" I asked. "Anyone in this lounge," she said. "It sits near the kettle. People pass it round." That is true. The caddy had been communal. The scrap left there could belong to any pair of pockets in any mind. Still, the timing was precise, and the ledger's entry had matched the initials as if two separate hands had pressed a single truth. I kept the scrap in a small envelope and walked back to the compartment where Conrad sat near the lamp, looking as if he had been worn thin by the effort of being a man expected always to keep a life under an iron rule. "You were nervous earlier," I said without ceremony. Conrad's face betrayed a small flinch. To be observed in the close way of a carriage is sometimes the smallest of humiliations. "It's been a trying few days," he said. "My daughter was accepted to a university, and I wanted to ensure everything was proper. Mr. Reed suggested a compensatory arrangement. He said certain signatures might be best kept private." "What did you do when he suggested it?" I asked. Conrad folded his hands. I told him I would think on it. He pressed. He was unpleasant. He has a way of being the one with the upper hand. I paid him once before because some things are easier to handle with cash. I thought it would end there. Did you go to the corridor to speak to him again? I asked. He hesitated. It is the nature of confessions that they come, if at all, in small, reluctant bursts. Yes, Conrad said. We spoke. I went to clarify things. He laughed. He held out his hand for more. I left. I told him I would make arrangements in the morning. Who did you see leaving the corridor? Marjorie chimed in. Simon said he saw a man hurry out. He had his hat on. Conrad's face paled a touch. Was it? His sentence broke. Then he cleared his throat. I do not think so. I think that was someone else. These human frumbles are not evidence on their own. They are rather cracks, where light can be let through if you wait patiently. I continued my small maneuvering by asking for the ledger again, and Ruth obliged. The CH notation had a little vertical stroke beside it that matched a notation on the scrap I had found. The handwriting was not identical, but it carried the same firm, practical pressure. I turned my attention to something else. The small smear beneath the door where Gus had been found. It had not been obvious in the lighting of the initial discovery. Now, with the lamp tilted and Ruth having shared a torch, the mark showed as a faint, darker impression. Not the violence of a struggle, but a small abrasion, as if one person had bumped against the skirting when leaving in a hurry. When I stepped back into the lounge, I noticed that Conrad's sleeve bore a faint, darkened mark that might have been the same as, or similar to, that smudge. He wiped it with the back of his hand hastily and looked away. I made a mental note and did not say anything. Such private gestures are often the most telling because they are done innately, before the mind has had the chance to construct an alibi. Meanwhile, Dr. Elias had, in the quiet, checked the exact time not only on the watch that lay on the table, but the digital time on his phone, which had some battery left. He noted the sequence of events as he had seen them and said nothing of what he suspected, beyond the clinical fact that the period of possible engagement with Gus could be narrowed to a brief quarter of an hour. Small windows of time are my favorite allies. They make opportunities less generous and explanations more precise. I listened as Conrad's account settled into a series of inconsistencies. He had said he would think on it, then later told me he left hurriedly. He had earlier offered that he might be called to attend to a meeting he expected to hold in the morning. The envelope he had kept had not been sealed, and inside I found a bank receipt. The receipt bore a stamp, and that peculiar shorthand bankers use when money is handed in physically. The amount was not ruinous, but it was meaningful. It corroborated the ledger's notation and suggested a payment had indeed been expected. It is a curious thing to watch a man rot inward with the knowledge that an action he took or did not take has consequences beyond the ledger. He did not look like an evil man. He looked like a man who made a private contract with his moral world, and then found the contract changed. At one point, Lena came to me and touched my sleeve, drawing me aside with a small, honest air. I did not like him, she said softly, not because he was a monster, because he made a career of taking. She handed me a folded scrap of paper, a letter from years back with a note that Gus had made about a dispute. He said my mother owed him, she said. Her hands were steady. I came to ask for a word, that is all. I thought perhaps to make him see his own cruelty. We are inevitably creatures who act, sometimes foolishly, because of old hurts. The missing piece, when it makes itself known, usually sits in the lacework of small actions, a payment, a hurried exit, a smudge on a sleeve, a ledger that names you in shorthand. The scrap and the receipt together were not a trap. They were two small, practical things that told a story of business done in small envelopes and private hushes. It was enough to point to a likely sequence. Mr. Reed had expected payment from CH. CH had been in the lounge and had an envelope that matched. Someone hurried from the corridor not long before the body was discovered. I wrote the time into my notebook and drew a small line connecting the ledger to the envelope, to the smear, and to the scrap. It was modest detective work, patient, careful, and reluctant to lay a final hand on the whole truth. But in the quiet geometry of evidence, lines draw themselves and the picture becomes clearer. The missing piece was not a dramatic revelation, but the simple confirmation of a transaction and a hasty movement. The consequences of that confirmation were, I suspect, far more human and far less clean than any of us would like to admit. I folded the scrap and slipped it back into my pocket. It is not my habit to keep things to myself when they might aid the process of justice, but that night I also felt the need to carry the knowledge a little further, to give it time to settle. The carriage slept and woke in small, breathless moments, like someone who dreams in fragments. There was nothing left to do until the authorities could be reached. For now, we kept watch and kept one another company in the hush. Dawn is a slow critic. It arrives without malice, but with an honesty that makes nocturnal half-answers stand up and be judged. We were still between stations when the first indigo of morning found the edges of the trees. The countryside outside took on a new patience. Inside the train, the air felt changed by light, as if soft illumination had a way of slicing through small pretenses. We had slept in bursts, the way people sleep when a single thought hangs in the air, someone who cannot quite let rest. I had the impression of people repeating actions so that the muscle memory of them felt steadier. Ruth kept on checking the logbook and looking at the corridor as if the act of looking might solidify the night's sequence into fact. I had, in the small hours, replayed the lines in my mind and turned pieces of them like a person handling a beloved and worn object. Conrad's movements were no longer so precise. At one point he stood up and walked to the vestibule as if compelled by something I could not name. He did not notice my presence behind him until he turned. When he did, there was a fatigue in his face that looked almost like honesty. "Can I speak with you?" he asked quietly. We did not go to the lounge. We remained at the small table under the amber light, the ledger and the scrap I had found between us like a modest altar. I have never been one for confrontation theatrics. When the truth presents itself, it prefers calm. "You do not have to tell me everything," I said. "Only what is true." Conrad exhaled as if he had been holding his breath for years. He put the envelope on the table and opened it with a domestic care. Inside were a few banknotes, a small folded letter, and a receipt. He pushed them toward me, as if asking me to read the face of a trouble he had tried to fold away. "Mr. Reed pressed me," Conrad said slowly. "He said he would make public certain things if I did not help him. He mentioned Emily, my daughter. He said he could make her application public, show that a scholarship had been influenced. He was cruel in the way he enjoyed having the cards." His hands trembled. It is important to notice how people speak when shame and fear have the room to come forward. Conrad's voice was not loud and it was not dramatic. It was quiet in a way that suggested a man finally conceding his small private truth. "What did you do?" I asked. At first I gave him money to keep him at bay. It was not a grand sum. I thought that would be the end of it. Tonight he asked for more than I had. He cornered me. He spoke as if he had the right to take what I had. I lost my temper. I shoved him. Conrad's hands were sudden and honest now. "I did not mean to kill him, Mr. Crowe. I just wanted him to stop." He laughed. He stumbled and fell. He looked at the table as if the folds of paper there had suddenly become something like a hinge on his life. "You left?" I asked. "Yes," he said, "I left. I was afraid. I thought there would be time to explain. I did not call for help because I thought the scene would be worse with me there. I am ashamed." This, in the ordinary ledger of human confessions, is where the cruel and the compassionate meet. Conrad's honesty was not dramatic. It was small and terrible in the way that real culpability often appears. He had admitted to a shove. In the study of such events, a shove is a physical act. Whether it was the proximate cause of death is another matter that requires careful thought. There are medical facts to be considered and legal consequences that belong beyond the carriage. What Conrad had done, he admitted, and that admission, made privately and without spectacle, reframed much of the night's geometry. I asked him the small practical question of where they had been and precisely what was said. His memory, freed from the show of self-protection that had owned him earlier, grew more detailed in the way of someone who finally understands the need to be truthful. He demanded, Conrad said. He said he knew things about me that would make my daughter ashamed. He made an offer. I was humiliated, and I lashed out. It was horrible. I did not speak of judgment. It is not my place to be prosecutor in the quiet car of a stranded train, but it was my place to see how threads joined. The ledger's marking CH. Final, the receipt in the envelope, the scrap of paper under the caddy. Together they formed a narrative of negotiation and of a man who had been lining up demands. "Why did you not tell Ruth?" I said. "Why not call for help?" Conrad's hands folded over the table and his voice narrowed. "Because there are things that cannot be made public without ruining someone. It is a disgusting calculus, but I thought I was buying time. I thought I would be clever. I thought this would be a small ladder out of something bad. I did not imagine." His words trailed, and he swallowed. "It was cowardice. That is all. There are small ways in which the human heart will attempt to justify what it has done. Conrad's attempt was of that sort. It had been a selfish move made to protect rather than destroy, but selfishness is not innocent of consequence. In the privacy of that small table we stitched together the events as they likely unfolded. Conrad felt cornered, and in a moment of ugly panic he made the motion of a shove. Gus stumbled, perhaps struck his head on a corner, perhaps collapsed. The exact medical cause would need to be established beyond us. That is the province of those who examine the body with instruments and testing. But the human action, the shove, was admitted by a man who had been keeping payments in envelopes and hiding fear beneath propriety. Conrad asked me quietly what he should do. I have no license to advise on matters of law. I can, however, speak about the human consequence of telling truth. "You must tell the authorities," I said. "You must give them what you have. This is the only honest route now." He nodded. He rose with a heavy air, and together we sought Ruth. There was no yell, no dramatic revelation. The confession that matters in such small places is the one made quietly, for the hope that honesty will relieve the weight of the night. Ruth received the news with a slow gravity. She thanked Conrad for his honesty and told him that the appropriate steps would be taken as soon as we could reach the proper authorities. Conrad sat back down afterwards with a sort of shrunk dignity. He had confessed to an action that had consequences he had not intended. What this did in practical terms was turn suspicion into something more precise. It did not erase the fact that there had been other grievances in the carriage. It merely located the most immediate thread. People who had been named in the ledger were not innocent in all senses. They had grievances, small cruelties, debts that were real. But there is difference between displeasure and a confession of violence. I spent the remainder of the dim hours before the station thinking about motive and the way fear moves people to make choices they later regret. I watched those around me and tried to hold my feeling in proportion. There is sorrow enough in human action without adding the theatre of condemnation. When the authorities finally met us at a small frost-lipped platform, the carriage felt like a tiny boat arriving at shore. We passed over the border between a private injured knight and the public steps of procedure. I felt, as I often do in such crossings, a deep and odd fatigue. The morning had come, and with it the crowd of necessary consequences, but the smallness of the confession, its hush and its honesty, had altered the shape of the night. When the official people arrived, with jackets that smelled of damp street and clipboards that suggested a heavier interest than the one we had been assuming, they politely took the reins. They asked their questions with a kind of dryness that is necessary to the doing of proper work. They used numbers and forms. They were, in their way, as procedural as Ruth and as clinical as Dr. Elias. For a while, I stood at the back and allowed them to do what they do best, to shape the chaos into a report. Conrad had been truthful when he told Ruth and the small team that he had pushed Augustus Reed. There was, as we all expected, a sequence of practical outcomes. Conversation in low tones shifted from speculation to the framework of an inquiry. The police asked for times, for the notes and scraps. Ruth provided the logbook. Dr. Elas supplied his clinical observations. The ledger and the scrap that had been tucked in the sugar caddy were taken and carefully bagged. It is remarkable how calmness and carefulness are similar. Both are quiet and both give room for something like truth to be heard. The officers, with their polite gravity, thanked everyone for their cooperation and explained the steps that would follow. They were neither accusatory nor indulgent. They were steady in the way of people whose work requires them to be the balance between what has occurred and what must be done next. Conrad, for his part, made the statements he needed to make. He described his relationship with Gus, the payments, the embarrassment, the shove. He did not add flourish. There was no melodrama, only the simple, honest confession of an action that had consequences he could not undo. As the officers listened, I watched the faces of the others in the carriage. There was, if not relief, at least the settling of something like clarity. Lena's face was a map of restraint. She did not gloat. Dr. Elias watched, as if a distant man might in a theatre. Marjorie sat with her knitting bag and looked as if she were knitting a phrase into a sentence that might become tolerable. I was asked by one of the officers if I had anything to add. I told the officer that I had been paying attention to small details and that I had preserved certain notes in writing. I gave over the scrap from the sugar caddy and the folded ledger page. These were accepted with thanks and recorded. They mattered because, in the final account, the law relies on small things as much as on confessions. Later, when we had been given time to sit in a little waiting room with tea that tasted like a formality, the officer who handled routine inquiries asked a question that was not in his script. "Do you think he meant to do it?" He asked me in a voice that wondered at motive, in a way the forms do not. It is a useful and dangerous question. It requires a private weighing of intention against action. I can only answer with what I had observed. He did not set out to be a killer, I said. He intended to stop the man. The shove was an act of anger and fear that is not the same as planning death, but fatal in consequence. The officer's voice was the dispassionate instrument of catalogue. We all know the terrible arithmetic of such things. An action, however small in intent, that meets with misfortune can become a tragedy that changes lives. The law will determine the formal consequences. The human hearts in the carriage would determine the other consequences, how they understood one another in the evening ahead and the quiet days after that. There was a moment later when I allowed myself to speak plainly to the assembled passengers, not in accusation, but in a form of closure that felt humane. I sat with them around the small table and offered what I had seen, patterns and small truths corralled into a narrative. I spoke of the ledger and of the scrap, of the envelope and of the receipt, of the smear on the skirting board, and of the watch that had told a time that matched the sequence of movements. I tried to be slow and careful in the way I speak, because slowness in these things is a courtesy. This was not the act of a villain stalking its prey, I said. It was the action of a man who was frightened and angry and chose to act in a way that was violent and selfish. That made the result terrible. It is a human failing, not a cartoon of wickedness. That matters because it means we must respond with justice and with an understanding of the human desperation that prompts certain acts. Lena listened with the quiet of a person who has made room in her heart for truths that are both sorrowful and complicated. She did not wish to see another person destroyed, but she did want fairness. She had come to the carriage with a small private grievance and left with a knowledge that the world is more likely to be changed by a human failing than by malice alone. When the train finally crawled into the station, it felt as if the long night had been cast into a narrow and public corridor. People stepped onto the platform with the slow fingers of sleep still clinging to them. The police took Conrad away in a manner that was not dramatic. There was no shouting, no arrests that feed the appetite for theatre. Rather, it was the practical, lawful thing. People did their job, and the machinery of consequence moved in the way modern life requires. I stayed behind for a time, offering Ruth a quiet word of thanks for how she had managed those fragile hours. She nodded with that weathered, professional calm. "We do what we must when there is no one else," she said. "I have a son waiting for me at the next stop. He will need me. So will everyone else. There is a compassion in the ordinary, unglamorous duties of people like Ruth. It is a real and enduring thing." The carriage, once emptied of most passengers, felt like a room that had held a great weight and then had been relieved of it. People would in time tell the tale in different ways. They would remember the small ticks and the larger facts. But the quiet revelation that this was an act elected in a moment of fierce, private fear rather than a premeditated murder had been established enough to shape what followed. We left the scene with a different gait. The morning air was cold and bright, and the town had a small, watchful look about it. People went their ways. The legal consequences would unfold with their own steady dullness. We, who had been passengers and witnesses, went into the day with the disquieting knowledge that ordinary men make terrible mistakes. My part was minor. I had listened and urged a small honesty. The rest was falling to the wheels of an outside system. The day rose like a curtain, soft and inevitable. The station smelled of wet stone and coffee, and the kind of briskness that repairs the small ruptures of night. There were statements to be given and forms to be signed, engines greased and lines cleared. People moved with the business-like composure of those who have had the night rearrange them and now wish to return to a life that feels manageable. Before I left the station, I walked once more into the carriage that had been the center of the night's small calamity. The lamps were off. The upholstery carried the faint impression of bodies that had been there through a long vigil. A scrap of knitting still hung from Marjorie's bag, and Ruth's lovebook lay on the little table with a pen placed across the open page. Small things remain after we are done with the great ones: a pencil, a folded receipt, a kettle that has been put away. There is a quality to these endings that is not neat. Justice, if it arrives, will do so with legal steps and official language. But the human settlement of feeling, the way a community of strangers deals with the knowledge that one of their number acted and harmed another, is always quieter and more complicated. Conrad had been taken aside with courtesy and firmness. He had confessed the shove in a private moment and had been led away in order that the proper authorities could account for consequences. Many of us sat with different feelings: relief, a twitch of guilt, a fatigue that had nothing to do with sleep. Lena was the first to approach me as I stood in the doorway. She carried her sketchbook, its corners softened by the night. "Thank you for listening," she said simply. "It is easier when someone listens with a patient ear." Her voice was gentle in a way that made the harsh edges of the last hours feel less sharp. "I only observed," I said. "The people involved told me more of themselves than I ever could. People are rarely wholly villainous or wholly innocent. They are often both generous and small in ways that sweep against each other." She smiled, a small private thing. "My mother used to say that people carry burdens like folded shirts. You only see the neatness on the outside." "That is true," I said. "And sometimes the fold is a little too tight." We stood in the doorway and watched the station begin to move into its pattern of work. Commuters streamed past, each with their own inside weather. A child yawning on a parent's shoulder, a man adjusting a scarf, a woman consulting a timetable like an ancient scripture. The world continues. That is the unexpected kindness of it. It will not stay fixed on anyone's sorrow for long. It must go about its business. Ruth came down the carriage steps to join us. She was arranged by the world the way a good conductor is, steady, pragmatic, and not surprised by the oddness of life. "We will file the report," she said. "We will tell the truth as we know it. And then we will travel on. Do you think it will change you, going through this?" I asked. She looked at the platform and then at the people streaming by. "I am always changed, Mr. Crowe," she said. "But our work is to make sure that change does not break us. People come with their troubles and sometimes their worst actions. We see them and we carry the work forward. That is how we live with it. There is a certain moral of small possible consolation in that. The world can absorb some tragedies and continue to move, not in the sense of forgetting, but in the sense of living in the open workaday way that makes the future possible." The people in the carriage would have to walk forward with the memory of the night. Conrad would walk forward with the knowledge of what he had done and the consequence of it. Those are not things that can be undone by explanation. I took my ticket to the next train and folded into the flow of commuters with the thoughtful slowness of someone reluctant to leave a scene when all the small loose ends have not yet been tied. Marjorie returned to the life of her small household and to her granddaughter's arms. Dr. Elias returned to his clinic, where he would be required to keep a steadier watch on the people who trust him. Lena took the audition, and whether or not the panel accepted her, she would forever carry the night in the way we all carry our private histories. Ruth went back to the workbench of timetables and lanterns. As for me, I walked back toward the town with the weather in my face and the remembered murmur of the carriage still in my ears. I think about these things for a long time. I consider the line between an action that is planned and one that is born from a human heart frayed by fear. When people are pressed, they sometimes do crueler things than they ever imagined. We are not often monsters when we commit harm. We are people who chose badly in a moment of panic. That night between stations has stayed with me because it was, in its simplest form, a human story. It was not one of grand villainy, nor of immaculate virtue. It was the ache of private fear and the weight of small choices. It taught me again that many tragedies begin with ordinary acts and that the response to them requires both accountability and compassion. We can pursue justice without losing sight of the fact that grief and shame are human reactions, and holding both is the work that comes after. If you listened closely tonight, perhaps you saw the pattern as I did. The ledger and the envelope, the scrap and the receipt, the hurried exit and the small smear that matched a neat shoe. Perhaps you guessed the one step that moved the situation from argument to irreparable harm. If you did, well done. The best part of a mystery is the moment when the quiet makes sense. For those who stay with these stories, I will only say this: be gentle with yourself and others. We share small worlds in the dark, and sometimes we hurt one another by accident or by panic. The work afterward, of telling truth, of facing consequence, of learning, is the only way forward. Thank you for sharing this quiet case. Rest easy, and I will meet you in the next one.